Well, let's get to know one of my favorite Green Lanterns, and particularly the era of comic books that made him one of my favorites. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics one week, well, usually after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. A bit of a different focus this time. In each installment, I normally pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Normally, I go into full spoilers for everything. I'm going to dance around some spoilers. I don't know, it's probably going to be a mix, actually, of spoilers and not spoilers. But I do think that everything that I talk about is worth reading, even if some details are spoiled. Well, in the week's comics that came out to the Ultra tier of DC Universe Infinite last week, I just didn't have anything that I was really excited to talk about from a story standpoint or thematically speaking, but still wanting to put something out there about DC Comics. I realized, over the weekend, a friend of mine was asking for recommendations for Green Lantern comic books, just to get to know the character, the history. And so a lot of that was pretty easy to kind of recommend. And then I realized that there's this Kyle Rayner era of Green Lantern that really should be represented in some way. At the time, I was just like, okay, so read these, read Emerald Twilight, and then if you want, read whatever Kyle Rayner stuff you want. But beyond that, I didn't have a good recommendation. After that, I went home, opened up DC Universe Infinite, looked at the Get to Know Kyle Rayner section that'll pop up if you search for his name, and it's okay, but it really focuses on stuff after Green Lantern Rebirth, which kind of brought the Green Lantern Corps back. And I think that the stuff that is most formative to who Kyle is, certainly that establishes who he is, happens well before that, happens in the mid to late 90s. And so although they do kind of reference some of those storylines on the Get to Know Kyle Rayner page, including 0 Hour Crisis in Time, which is a crossover event during which he really came into his own as a Green Lantern. Then Final Night, of course, which involves Hal Jordan, kind of like his final fate. Final until it wasn't so final years later. And then Blackest Night, I think of those three, probably I would just focus on 0 Hour Crisis in Time, Final Night, and then I guess you could jump to... I'm a little surprised they didn't put Green Lantern Rebirth as one of the stories here. But so I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you guys the list of Kyle Rayner era Green Lantern issues that I put together in preparation to share with my friend and say, hey, here's the reading list. If you want like a fairly concise, it works out to be, I guess, like 39 issues. Is that what it was? 39 issues that I picked that I think are a good sampling of Kyle Rayner, what his era was like, and some of the key story moments. So just kind of off the cuff, talking through them a bit. First, we do have Green Lantern 48 through 50, which is the Emerald Twilight story that has Hal Jordan losing it in a very, at the time, shocking story, and bringing an end to the entire Green Lantern Corps until basically just one ring survives that whole encounter and one Guardian survives, and that ring is then given to Kyle Rayner just randomly. He walked out of a bar in the middle of the night. Well, that moment is assigned more purpose and intentionality in a soft reboot later on, but in this first issue is just like, you'll have to do, you're just the guy that's available. And I think what they were going for there was trying to show you a story about like what it would be like for us as the reader to get the Green Lantern ring, where we're not honest and fearless. We don't necessarily have great willpower. We just have this ring that can create all this stuff that whatever we can imagine with our minds. This era is also very significant because it did away with the yellow limitation of the rings that existed up to this point, where they could not affect anything on the yellow spectrum. So that was a huge limitation that was stripped away. And with Rebirth, they briefly kind of brought it back, but then got rid of it again, and there was a rationalization for all of that that had to do with overcoming fear. But here, Kyle's ring was actually designed differently so that it did not have that problem inherent in it. But it also lacked the artificial intelligence that existed in the Green Lantern Corps rings. And so, for example, didn't have a force field that would automatically spring up to protect him if he's caught by surprise. He has to be aware of danger enough to consciously bring up a force field to protect himself, or he can just get knocked over the head with a lead pipe. And I did not like that aspect of it. I was fine with them getting rid of the yellow limitation, but I didn't like the artificial intelligence being lost. It took away some of the cool, I thought, sci-fi elements of the concept of the ring. Nevertheless, one of the coolest things about the Kyle Rayner run was that Kyle Rayner is an artist, like a visual artist. He draws, he paints, and all of that was brought to bear in his construct creations. And prior to this, the different Green Lanterns, they had a pretty narrow list or palette of constructs they would create, like boxing gloves or a giant sledgehammer, different things like that. You started seeing some ideas getting reused when Hal Jordan or Guy Gardner or whoever would use the ring, or they would just stick with just a default energy blast. But when Kyle got the ring, they made a lot of the fact that he's an artist and he would just be brimming with creative ideas for constructs that he would create. And so if you liked that imaginative the imagination fueled concept of the Green Lantern ring, the Kyle Rayner era is where it's at. I mean, every construct he created was unique and original. I don't know if much of anything was ever repeated. The artists were always just having a field day with the constructs that he would create. And that made it such an engaging comic, and it made the concept more exciting than ever before in terms of just seeing the sense of potential that it had, being limited only by his imagination. So it was an interesting era because of those elements, and we also get to see a Green Lantern really figure things out from the beginning, where he's really not very capable. And over a long period of time in the Kyle Rayner era, he is slowly becoming more and more capable as a Green Lantern. And there's always kind of a lingering question in the background of like, well, is he ever going to eclipse Hal Jordan? Hal Jordan, before he went nuts, was the greatest Green Lantern of all time. This is before Jeff Johns, did the Rebirth thing and really cemented in people's minds, no, Sinestro was the greatest Green Lantern of all time, which is an interesting twist and kind of helps just dodge the whole debate between is Kyle or Hal better in the mythos of Green Lantern. But in Kyle Rayner's era, that was a question. Like, is he ever going to eclipse Hal? And really, by the end, he is blowing away what Hal did with the ring. He does so much more and on a much bigger scale than Hal ever did when he was just using a normal charge of the ring. And so it's really cool to kind of see his growth. So let me just talk through some of the key story arcs, the issue numbers. I already mentioned Green Lantern 48 through 50. That's where Hal goes nuts. The Green Lantern Corps is destroyed, and at the end of that, there's a hint of this guy Kyle getting the ring. 51 is where things really kick off, and a lot of the issues I chose highlight him getting acquainted with major characters in the DC universe. But in this first arc, he goes up against Mongol and also meets Superman at the same time. And that's significant because Mongol is the one that was at the command, basically, of Cyborg Superman, responsible for destroying Coast City. So he has a connection to the Green Lantern mythos at this time, more to Hal Jordan, but still, this was an appropriate kind of matchup to have. These opening issues also have a devastating loss on the part of Kyle Rayner in terms of something just brutal that happened to his girlfriend Alex involving a refrigerator. And it became, well, I guess before they were calling them memes, it became a meme or maybe just kind of like a moment that was referenced on a meta level among writers. I think that maybe it was Gail Simone that once was talking at a Q&A at Comic-Con about really wanting to have female characters that were not just used to provide motivation for heroes to go out and do good, and referencing, I think, Kyle Rayner and the fact that it was the loss of Alex that really pushed him into taking his responsibility with this Green Lantern ring seriously. I look back, I don't know that I didn't see it as controversial at the time in terms of like the role of female characters in comics. I think in some ways it kind of became a touch point for that conversation, but at the time I didn't think it was necessarily pigeonholing and limiting the kinds of roles that female characters could have in comics. It was very brutal. It was very shocking. And I think when I first read these comics, I was appreciating that. I was liking comics getting grown up and more serious and more heavy. And it doesn't get much more serious and heavy than what happened to Alex. That said, over time, whether we're talking about the roles of women or not, I more and more appreciate unique motivations for heroes that aren't based in tragedy, but that are based somehow in the moral fiber of their character and where those morals are derived from. Unfortunately, with the kind of like advent of relativism becoming a major way of thinking and viewing morality in the world, which started, I don't know, in my experience, I remember it really starting in the 90s, but it was certainly happening before then in the 60s and 70s. But I mean, with that whole thing taking on in people's minds in terms of how they view morality and the relativism of morality, you're less and less going to have characters or writers that know how to write characters with truly firm, objective moral values and a basis for those values that they're not ashamed or embarrassed or hesitant to kind of talk about. I think we often see in writing that people don't want to talk about the objective source of their values, say in their that may be found in their faith or something. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that we don't often get motivations for characters outside of tragedy and some of the other more predictable things. But I would want to see more of that today than I felt like I wanted at the time with the incident with Alex. Anyway, so that is, let's see here. That takes us up 51 through, I want to say, 55. He really was dealing with Major Force in issue 54. Major Force is the perpetrator of what happened to Alex. And I think that happened around 53 or 54, maybe at the end of 53. Anyway, 55 then is a crossover to the 0 Hour event, which ultimately we find out Hal Jordan plays a major role in. And so 55 is where Kyle first meets Alan Scott, the original Golden Age Green Lantern. I think that was an important kind of connection to have. Green Lantern number 0 then follows that, and that is a crossover that deals with Kyle Rayner and what was going on at the final climax of the 0 Hour event, also involving Hal Jordan and his new villainous persona of Parallax. So that's definitely a key issue to read. And then after that, we can jump a little bit to Green Lantern 60. This is part 3 of a 3-part story. The first 2 parts actually take place in Guy Gardner Warrior, that series. But it's called Capital Punishment, and it brings some degree of closure to Kyle Rayner's need or desire for vengeance against Major Force for what he did to Alex. And Guy Gardner Warrior definitely has a reason to want to take down or kill Major Force as well. So it kind of brings that to a close finally, and we see, okay, where is Kyle willing to cross that line? Is Guy Gardner willing to cross that line? And so there's I think a significant moment for both characters at the end of Green Lantern 60. Then jumping ahead just a little bit, 62 has kind of just a random menace in that issue, but we find out it's actually connected to Ganthet, the only remaining Guardian, and then that leads into issues 63 and 64, where Hal Jordan Parallax comes back into play for, I think, the last time as Parallax in Kyle's life. Apart from like a time-traveling Parallax later on. But this is kind of like the last encounter with them, and it really cements Hal by the end of this story as really a tragic villain. That he's not like this eyebrow twirl, or excuse me, mustache twirly villain. He's really a tragic villain who's lost so much and does what he does out of grief and this maddening desire to bring back bring back all that he has lost and that so many others have lost. And so I appreciated just the complexity there. Even though I had trouble with the Hal Jordan turn to being a villain, I did enjoy the complexity of him as this tragic villain, and I liked him having a place as Parallax in the DC universe. And so when he eventually died, I thought that was a bit of a missed opportunity to get rid of him like that. So anyway, that's 63 and 64 are called Parallax View, a two-part story that really has a prelude in 62. Then we jump ahead a little bit to 66 through 67, and this is where Kyle teams up with Wally West, the Flash, for the first time. And if you follow the JLA book from this era, you see between the team-ups that Kyle and Wally have in Green Lantern and also in the pages of The Flash every once in a while at this time, that these guys are developing a connection of friendship similar in some ways to what Barry and Hal had. And so I think this is an important issue to kind of like establish their connection, and then you can see that grow more in future crossovers if you really want to look for them, or in the pages of JLA. But I think that that's an important part of Kyle's story. And then 71 through 73 is a three-part story called Green Lantern Hero Quest. And this is, again, him meeting different key heroes in the DC universe and getting their perspective on what it is to be a hero. So in this story, he meets Batman, Captain Marvel, and Wonder Woman. And so, this is also cool as I look at all these key issues as Kyle is learning what it means to be a hero from interacting with all these different characters in the DC universe. As readers that maybe are getting into the DC universe for the first time, I think Kyle Rayner's journey, if you already are on board and want to read Green Lantern, but you've not really gotten into DC Comics much, I think Kyle Rayner's journey also introduces the reader bit by bit to major players in the DC universe. And so it's an introduction to not just Kyle Rayner and his journey, but a sample platter introduction to the DC universe as a whole, at least as it was here in the mid-90s. So then we jump ahead to Green Lantern number 81. This is an issue entirely dedicated to Hal's funeral, who died at the end of the events of the Final Night crossover. And so I think this just kind of helps bring a little bit of closure to Hal's story, to his life. And there is some complexity in what different people say as they step up to the podium and talk about his life. And I did find it moving when I read it back in the day, and when I've revisited it a time or two over the years. So I think it's definitely worth reading as part of Kyle's story, because it's kind of closing the book finally on Hal Jordan as a Green Lantern, at least as far as we knew as readers at this time. Then we jump ahead to a couple more crossover, or a couple more team-ups or meeting other characters. Green Lantern 86 and 87. In 86, Kyle meets Obsidian, and I believe it's in 86 that he starts his dating relationship with Jade. These two characters are the children of Alan Scott. And so again, there's an important Green Lantern connection there. He had a pretty long-term relationship with Jade. I think maybe it was the longest relationship he had in comics. I was a little bit frustrated with Kyle's relationships. He was dating, started with Alex and then Donna Troy at some point and Jade at another point. I just didn't like that he was in a bunch of shallow relationships kind of playing the field. And it's not that I thought his relationship with Jade was written to have all that much more depth, but at least it lasted longer and we could tell a little bit more of a developing story about his relationship with Jade. And then Green Lantern 87, that's just another meeting of a JLA member, or rather having a team up. I think they'd already met by this point, but it features Martian Manhunter, who also had a book at this time, which, it's arguably worth checking out. I thought it was all right. Then we jump ahead all the way to from 87 to 119, where Kyle Rayner interacts with Hal Jordan again, but now Hal Jordan is the Spectre after the events of, what is it even called? I can't remember. There was some crossover event. I didn't enjoy it. And by the end of it, Hal Jordan is the Spectre. And that was his new status quo all the way up until Green Lantern Rebirth, where he was brought back, reinstated, made a Green Lantern Corps member. But anyway, I think any kind of interactions between Kyle and Hal are important to Kyle's story, especially when Hal's status quo has changed as much as it has. So 119, I think, is definitely worth reading. Then we jump ahead again to Green Lantern 129, which is the beginning of Judd Winick's run on this book. And I really enjoyed a lot of Winick's run. What was his? Ron Mars, that's right. Ron Mars, who before this had a long run, I think, on Silver Surfer in Marvel. I'm not sure, I'm not as familiar with Marvel. But he had a really long run all the way up until, I think it was issue 128. So 0 to 128, I think were all written by Ron Mars. And he did some great stuff. But I think I enjoyed a number of things about Winick's run, especially the beginning of his run, even more than what had been going on with Ron Mars. And some of that has to do with Winick bringing back some of these historical elements of the Green Lantern Corps. In his first story arc, Kyle has to go up against a Manhunter, and these were the first attempt by the Guardians to create a galactic peacekeeping force of some kind, but they didn't work out and actually became very dangerous. And so since then, they have been causing problems in various ways at different times in the DC universe, and it's usually the Green Lanterns that have to put a stop to them. And so this is Kyle's introduction to this part of the Green Lantern mythos, and I enjoyed reading that. And then we continue. There's really no break all the way up until Green Lantern 36. So after the Manhunter thing in 132, we get the story of what is this gal's name? Fatality, who is really more of a villain for John Stewart, but she gets her hands on a yellow power ring like the one that Sinestro once had. We find out at the end of the issue how she got that yellow ring, but she's kind of like a surprise menace to Kyle, and it's a callback to this idea of the yellow ring that Sinestro had. So again, drawing from the history of the Green Lantern mythos. Well, she's not a right fit for the ring. She gets defeated pretty soundly, but the ring then, by those who made it, is put into the hands of someone else that is really going to cause problems for Kyle, and that's the character Nero, who, like Kyle, is extremely imaginative and is also completely insane and extremely sadistic. And his use of the yellow ring is like so effective, and is on such a huge level of power that his constructs are overtaking an entire city and like giving a challenge to the entire Justice League by the end of this story. And so Nero is really, I think, a fantastic villain, a scary villain, someone that really challenges Kyle and forces him to raise the bar in terms of what he's capable of doing with the ring. There are a few things that I miss that feel kind of sadly forgotten since the Jeff Johns rebirth era that brought the Corps back. And I think Nero is one of those villains that is sadly forgotten. I do think he was brought back briefly in some story, I can't remember where, but like I still, when I go back to this comic, I'm like, I think Sinestro is not as dangerous as Nero. They really tried to, when they did the rebirth thing and brought Sinestro back as a villain as well, they tried to make him like just the ultimate Green Lantern villain and like, oh man, he's really scary. But I don't know, reading what Sinestro does, yes, he had the whole Sinestro Corps thing, but just as an individual threat, I don't know that he stacks up to Nero. So I think Nero's a fantastic villain, and this story arc with Judd Winick, I think is really worth reading, especially if you're going to be visiting the Kyle Rayner era. Anyway, so that ends with 136. Then I would jump ahead to 144 and read from 144 through 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, all the way up through 150. And this really deals with the period in which Kyle's power was mysteriously growing. He was becoming like much more powerful than any Green Lantern had ever been. And eventually we get some insight into what that is, what was going on, and there's a new spin on it that's provided in the Rebirth era. But anyway, he gets to the point where he is able to fix John Stewart, who was paralyzed for years of comic book publishing at this time. He's able to get him to walk again. I think that happens in 147. He's able to give Jade her powers back. She'd lost her powers, and it's like nothing to him to just like fix her genetically or whatever was going on that was wrong inside of her. He just like it's nothing to him, just tells her, you're fixed, you know. And then in 149, we have, as the cover implies, a sort of a standoff between 149, which, I mean, this was a moment that was saying, hey, Kyle Rayner is like someone that could take on Superman now, and that could probably defeat Superman, maybe even defeat him easily. I mean, this is a crazy level of power that Kyle is at now. And then that whole kind of like major power stuff that's going on, it really gets resolved by the end of issue 150. And he also gets a new costume at the end of this time. And I think that 150, even though the last splash page has like a new costume for him, it implies this new beginning or whatever, I think that's probably the peak of the Kyle Rayner era. I like the new costume, but oddly enough, the stories that followed it weren't like my favorite stories in the Kyle Rayner era. I think it took a dip in terms of my personal love and engagement with this era of Green Lantern. But it's worth picking up again at the end of this run, right before Rebirth happened, in Green Lantern issues 180 and 181, where he is once more put up against Major Force. Major Force is just like one of those characters that is seemingly impossible to kill. And he's dealt with about as decisively as he could be, in a way that's really, I think, meant to give closure, to bring things full circle to where Kyle started with the tragedy of losing Alex, and then this final confrontation with Major Force in 180 and 181. And so I think on that level, it's worth reading those last two issues. It's part of a story arc that actually starts a few issues prior, so you can read those as a lead-in to 180 and 181, but I think if you're not super interested, you can just read 180 and 181, and it'll give you plenty of that sense of closure for Kyle's run. And then after that is the Rebirth era, and there's certainly plenty of good Kyle Rayner to be found in the Rebirth era and beyond, but DC Universe Infinite, in their recommended reading and stuff, I think it makes it pretty easy to find those issues, those storylines involving Kyle Rayner. I just felt like this was a major absence in what DC Universe Infinite was providing in terms of a recommended reading list for Kyle Rayner. So this was my crack at the best of the Kyle Rayner era. And my weekly ring selection, of course, has to be the Green Lantern ring, because, yeah, Green Lantern's awesome. And this was really... Green Lantern was already my favorite superhero concept by the time the Kyle Rayner era started, but actually reading these issues as it came out, because I own all of these issues. I was buying them weekly as they came out. This was, some of my heyday of comic book collecting during college, and this just so cemented in my mind the fact that I love Green Lantern as a superhero concept far more than any other. I mean, Flash is definitely a second. I don't know how close a second I would say he is. I just freaking love the whole concept of Green Lantern. At the end of the day, it doesn't even matter that much to me who is wearing the ring, as long as it's a good story being told. The concept alone is enough to really pull me in. So anyway, I think those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, love getting your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. If you want this content as a monthly podcast, you can get it in the monthly Essential Issues podcast. Just check out your iTunes, other podcast services. You should be able to find it wherever you're finding podcasts. If not, let me know and I'll try to get it there. But you can also go to christiangeekcentral.com. There's a ton of content that I'm making there for you as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.